So, offensive media. By offensive media, I don't just mean like stuff that was made to intentionally be offensive. I also mean stuff that wasn't supposed to be offensive, but just wound up being aberrantly just fucked up and not okay. And when I'm talking offensive, I don't mean people go, I don't like this because meh, I'm a sensitive bitch baby. I mean things like someone just drawing a picture of them boiling a bunch of trans people alive or something. Stuff that's just, without question, absolutely transphobic, racist, and stuff like that for no reason other than to be transphobic and shitty. I'm also talking about media like We Are the Ants, which wasn't supposed to be offensive, but is practically a how-to guide how to kill yourself. So stuff that's more or less damaging to society or people, and by damaging I mean actually damaging, not just the pseudo bullshit that you hear sometimes. These serve no purpose really other than just to be this person's outlet for their bigoted, crappy opinion, or just to actively hurt other people. There are a lot of people out there that just make art just to hurt other people, purely because I think it's funny. There'll be those people that have the opinion that all jokes are good jokes, no matter what, which isn't generally true. Often it's true, but not always. And then you'll have the ones that make art, or media in general, like the We Are the Ants one, where they think they're generally helping, generally doing good, or generally being a good representation, but instead they're just being negative, this gigantic stereotype that just sets everybody back by worlds. It's kind of the same reason why depicting black people with gigantic puffy lips and the stereotypical blackface thing is never really considered remotely good in any form of art. Even if you're trying to make an actual point that's a good point, you don't use blackface generally. Because it doesn't do anyone any good to use blackface, really. The same goes with a pot of boiling trans people alive. There's no not horrible aspect to that. There's no way it isn't, like, outrageously offensive and fucked up and transphobic. And the flip side of this, of course, is you have media, art, stuff like that, that's offensive and inflammatory, but it's got a purpose, a meaning. Like the pictures of kids with gas masks on, or the love sign that's made with guns. Those things actually have an actual legitimate message behind them, a meaning, something that's supposed to make you think. There's a huge difference between that and stuff that's just offensive for the sake of pissing people off and hurting people and fucking society over a little bit. And then, of course, you also have media that can be seen offensively, that's just someone getting an outlet. You can see this a lot with, like, children's kind of darker drawings. A lot of parents will freak out and go, oh my god, this is horrible, this is bad, when it's really just their kid going nutters and scribbling because they're pissed off. And of course, there's also whether or not you show it to other people. If you're not showing it to anyone other than yourself, then, well, it can't do anybody any harm, so it's not really that big of a deal. But you have places like Tumblr and YouTube, where people put their shit out to the world, and sometimes that's not always a good thing. Again, We Are the Ants is an example of this, because, well, it's a publicated book that you can buy from, like, chapters and shit, when really you shouldn't be able to. If this is just something somebody read on the computer and read for their own ness, and never showed to anyone else, it wouldn't matter. But once you start showing it to other people, you have to kind of keep in mind if there's a message behind it, or a point, or if you're just being a dick to the world to be a dick to the world. And if you're just doing stuff to hurt other people, then really you're wasting your own energy and you're not helping society at all. Channel that shit to other things. And back to the offensive media bit. It's not as common as it used to be, honestly, but at the same time, you see a lot of, especially conservative groups, will basically create this sort of stuff. TERFs are another example that would often make transphobic art and shit, and they'll post it as like this great, good, wonderful thing, when it's really just them being a piece of shit, and throwing their piece of shitness into the world for other people to look at and ultimately feel attacked by or threatened by. And, of course, the worst kind of offensive media is offensive media that's actually legitimate threats to other people, which is horrendously uncommon, thankfully, but it does happen, and it is kind of stupid when it does happen. Because sometimes you look at it and it's like, this is dumb and you were stupid. Other times it's, wow, this person really means it. Okay. And then, of course, you have the people that will idolize people that put out the offensive media. And of course they'll say, oh, it's just a person being real. They're just being real. When usually the person's just doing it to be a dick. They're not being real. This is especially true, again, with the We Are the Ants book, which is marketed as being realistic, when really there's nothing about it that's realistic at all. And I find that often with people who claim that they're just being real with their offensiveness. Well, bigotry more so. More often than not, it's not them being real, it's just them being a prick and trying to excuse it by saying, I'm being real. And this sort of media, it does do harm to society currently, today, more so than in the past, because we have the internet. So everything can be accessed through the internet. The wonderful thing that is the internet. So when you create something that's just nothing but harmful to other people, it's a lot easier for other people to see it. Whereas way back when, no one saw it unless you were fucking famous. Or for somehow you got, like, random fluke and everybody saw your shit. But now it's like, even if you're a fucking nobody, everyone will see your shit. If you want them to. If you post it online, anyway. So it's got more options to hurt people. This is especially true with children. Children are a lot easier to influence, and stuff like the offensive media, pretty much, has a much better chance of fucking kids up. Though I will say that I would rather a kid see something that's just, like, fucked up and wrong, and just, like, weirdly offensive media, than them get bombarded by a bunch of just blaringly fake news, but it isn't obvious that it's blaringly fake. Because being misinformed can also often be far more dangerous than just seeing fucked up shit. And both things are kind of a huge problem in the world today, unfortunately. But 'tis the internet and how interconnected we all are. And of course, when you put out offensive media as transphobic, stirring the pot with trans people boiling alive in it kind of a thing, you get that ideology out to more people, and you have more people who will fall in line with the let's kill all trans people, or all black people must go back home, or whatever the crap that people tend to say. So the more people see it, the more people might get sucked into it and think this is actually a good belief to have, that this is the correct belief, that this is the right belief. You'll have more people actually falling in line with it. But the flip side is you'll also have more people seeing it and going, that's fucking stupid, and ripping that person a new one. It's just, you gotta hope that people rip that person a new one. It's very easy also for things to fly under the radar sometimes, because with there being so much fucked up shit on the internet, and so much offensive media, which is not as bad as most people like to think. Well, I guess I don't really like to think that, but you get my point. A lot of it just completely flies under the radar, and no one notices it to call it out on its being shitty. Again, We Are the Ants thing is an example of it. Not a lot of people have read the book. I'm one of the few, and I only read it because I got it free. So a lot of shitty things will fly under the radar, which allows for the people to support it to just support it in larger and larger numbers until, uh-oh, big problem. Just like the incels thing that's going on right now in Canada. So there's the good side and the bad side of things being noticed, not noticed, whatnot. But people definitely overestimate how much offensive stuff is out there, because for the most part, it's kind of difficult to make something that's genuinely just completely offensive, unless you're a raging bigot who, like, wants to hurt people. Those are generally the only ones, and then you, of course, have the people who just kind of accidentally do something really fucking stupid, but they don't think it's stupid. That, of course, happens. Unfortunately, it tends to happen to famous people more often than non-famous people. Kind of sucks for the famous person, but it gives the rest of the world a bit of an example of what not to do in the spotlight. And this is one area where I think artists and people who write books, authors, musicians, they have a little bit of responsibility to not be a gigantic flaming piece of shit. To not constantly produce all this, like, outrageously offensive with no purpose or meaning content. Because when you put that shit out there, you are responsible for the stuff you put out into the world. You're not responsible for how other people take it, but if you're putting things into the world that's just, you're putting it in the world to hurt people, yeah, you're a piece of shit. And honestly, this goes the same for, like, any media that's just all about kill the specific group. So, like, all the kill the Nazis things, yeah, no. Sure, sometimes it's got a meaning, but half the time I see this shit, it's just people wanting to kill other people. Which is just stupid. And the other half the time I see it, it's just threats. Vague threats. And that's just stupid. But more often than not, really offensive media doesn't get it to the mainstream popular light. Probably the closest thing that ever happened to that, which was like barely an offensive media thing, was that artist who like had held the decapitated head of Donald Trump. That, though, was a little bit of her just expressing being pissed off with the shitty president that he was. And, frankly, the same shit happened to Obama, and not nearly as many people complained about it. But that's one of the few examples that really got into the spotlight. Yeah, that wasn't in bad, horrible taste, the decapitated head thing. Yeah, that was horrible taste. Should have been done better. Should have been done a different way entirely, honestly. And then you can compare it to, like, what Marilyn Manson did in his little music video. That actually had some kind of definitive, obvious meaning to it, unless you blaringly ignored the meaning. Whereas the decapitated head thing didn't really have an obvious meaning. You could, like, dig and nitpick and look through the artist's stuff and find a meaning, but it wasn't obvious. And that's one area where there is a bit of responsibility for artists specifically, is making sure your meaning is somewhat obvious. Not, like, obvious, but at least enough that people can easily say, hey, there's the meaning right there, to the people who are too stupid to look for it. Of course, there's going to be people who will completely ignore the meaning, even if it is in your face, but ignore those stupid people, I'd say. Musicians can get away with offensive media a whole lot more because music in and of itself automatically has meaning most of the time. It's a lot easier to make meaning in music, and music is one of those things that really, as long as it's enjoyable, it doesn't need a meaning. Art can be that way too, but usually only in the aesthetic way. But musicians have a much easier time, so it's a lot harder to make blaringly just plain old offensive, should never have been made stuff with music. Because music, you can almost always find a meaning. I mean, look at ICP, really. Blaringly offensive, and hell, half the time there's no meaning. But it's still decent. Art's probably the harder one, and a novel, well, generally, unless you're just doing it entirely fucking wrong, there's gonna be a meaning to a novel. Again, We're the Ants is an example of it just done entirely fucking wrong. So. And when you do have media that's inflammatory, offensive, that actually has a meaning and a purpose, it will fly over some people's heads. It's gonna go way over some people's heads. And other people will completely fucking get it, or they might get it completely wrong. That's just the problem with media in general. People will completely misunderstand things no matter how obvious you make it. But if you've got meaning, then it's a good thing ultimately, but usually, if you're talking about something like race, or trans people, things like that, usually you're talking about society and how society doesn't treat a specific group fairly, or how there's some kind of hypocriticalness to some particular group, or you're just mocking the past. But usually, the mocking the past ones usually are really fucking obvious, though. You take, like, one look at that, it's like, wow, okay, yeah, the past sucked. It's like when people rehash the old, ridiculously sexist ads to just pretty much show how sexist the past was. That, in and of itself, has meaning. Whereas if someone just today just made a randomly sexist ad just purely for the sake of making a sexist ad, that doesn't really have a meaning. That's just them being shitty and putting sexism crap into the world and being offensive for no good reason.